Greetings and salutations, friends and followers of the lively arts. This is Jay Michaels here at the Passion Pit, bringing you one-on-ones with some of the movers, shakers, and art makers in the indie scene today. Now, while normally we have a pair of personalities at each program, today I've chosen just to do one-on-one. Last year I put out a call for reviewers, and some amazing talent showed up. One gent offered his services, and I thought he was just this really nice guy and a good writer. Then I saw his resume. Author of 19 books on the arts, member of the Tony nominating committee, and a really big deal at Playbill. In the end, after my shock, awe, and intimidation, I realized that he still is really a nice guy and a really excellent writer. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you Robert Viagas.
Hello, Jay.
Oh, what a surprise to find you home, Robert.
Yeah,
well,
I do get around. I do like to get out and see things and do things.
You're still on the air. It is great to speak to you, and I'm very happy to accuse you of this terrible crime. You are a humble soul, man. You are one humble soul. When I met you, I thought you were just this nice guy who writes really well. And it turns out you are a downright celebrity. You are an established author with what, 19 books under your belt?
20 books overall. 19 are just on entertainment. I did write one on golf.
Okay, well, there I stand corrected. And you were also part of the Tony committee. You were also a member of Playbill.
Yes, I was the managing editor there for about 24 years.
Oh my gosh! Tell our listeners about yourself, and let's see how impressed they are. They're going to be even more impressed than I was. Tell our listeners about yourself.
No, I'm really tall. I love theater, and I can whistle in harmony. That's it. Those are really my only talents.
That's it. Okay. Wow.
No, I've always loved theater. I've loved theater since I was a kid. I had a column in my local newspaper, which was the Franklin Square Bulletin in Franklin Square, New York. It was called Theater in the Square. When I was 17 years old, I wrote a theater column for them, and I used to review shows on Long Island, and I would go into the city, and I actually talked some of the New York press agents into letting me come and review them for the Franklin Square Bulletin.
Oh, that's
It was
great.
awesome. So as a result, since I started so young and since I'm now 3,000 years old, I've actually seen more than 2,000 shows just on Broadway.
Oh my gosh.
And I've also seen many shows in different countries, of course, off Broadway and around the United States. For 14 years, I was the theater critic of the New Haven Register. This was during the 1980s, and so I got to see all of August Wilson's plays in their original productions.
Gosh.
Some of them at the O'Neill Center, and I would sometimes have lunch with August. I didn't know he was August Wilson at that point. I thought he was, just an up and coming playwright. So I've just had the theater has just given me a wonderful, wonderful life, my friend, and still is.
How is it at Playbill? How is it on the Tony committee? Because there you were right in the hub in both cases. What was that like for you, for a theater lover like you? What was that like to be right there in the epicenter?
Well, as far as Playbill is concerned, I had always had a dream that I would start up a daily newspaper that had theater on the front page every day. This is a dream I had when I was a teenager. Because, I'd look at the New York papers, and they would almost never put a theater story on the front page. Even though that Broadway was right there and it was a major driver of the economy in New York, it'd be like the Los Angeles Times not covering Hollywood. I couldn't get why there weren't theater stories on the front page. So I fantasized about starting up a newspaper that would only have theater stories, or would put the theater stories on the front page. And in the meantime, I did work at actual newspapers. I worked at Newsday and the Gannett papers in Westchester and, a number of others. But I always had this dream, and I just filed it away as just one of those things that just would never come true until the internet came around.
And there you go.
And I realized I could start my theater newspaper, and it would be on the internet, but it would have the theater stories on the front page every single day.
Oh, that's
And at first they were a little skeptical. They were like, is there enough theater news to do that? And I said, well, it depends how you define theater news. I mean, if you wait until the entire cast is assembled to announce a show, yeah, that's one story. But if every time there's a star hired, that's a separate story. When tickets go on sale, that's another story. When previews start, that's another story. So, and if you expand it, because, so many things happen around the country and around the world that eventually impact on Broadway. I said, if we look beyond, the East River and the Hudson, there's a lot of theater news happening out there. And it turns out there were periods when we were moving 50 stories a day about theater things happening in the world. We never covered other planets, though. I'm going to leave that to my successors to eventually cover that. But
give it time. If there's money to be had, there you go. SpongeBob on Mars. Yes.
Someday I would love to do the first show. Oh, never mind. Yeah. That's another fantasy. But hey, some of my fantasies do come true.
I'm noticing that.
The theater one, and along the way, I've been very lucky that I've gotten to write a bunch of books. I worked with the original cast of Chorus Line on the book On the Line, the creation of a chorus line. I worked with the original cast of the Fantasticks on the amazing story of the Fantasticks. And when I was working on the Fantasticks, at that time it was still at Sullivan Street. And, Sullivan Street used to be an old speakeasy. So there was like all these little secret passages and spy holes. And that was like my clubhouse for a while. And, that's an experience that I still treasure to this day.
That is great.
And along the way, I wrote a book called The Alchemy of Theater, because we originally were going to do a book about different careers in the theater, things other than just being the star of the show and the director. And I wanted to talk about careers including, lighting designer and set designer, et cetera, et cetera. I realized that we couldn't just do a book about these different jobs, because those jobs only succeed when they're done in collaboration. That Broadway, the theater, is about collaboration. So I turned it into a book of essays on collaboration, and I got unbelievable people. I got Edward Albee to write about what it's like to collaborate as a playwright, and Hal Prince to write about what it was like to collaborate as a director, et cetera, et cetera. And I got to work personally with all these people. And I think because of that, I got the phone call. If you remember, there was the show Spam-A-Lot.
Of course.
And at one point, the show is close, so I'm not going to spoil this for anybody. But there's a very funny moment where the finger of God comes down and points. It's this giant finger that comes out of the fly space.
Right.
And points to somebody in the audience. That's the way I felt the day that call came. Would you like to be on the Tony committee, the Tony nominating committee?
Gosh.
And I think it was because I wrote that book. Because it's very easy for them to find people in the theater industry who they're an actor or they're an administrator or something like that, but very few of them know what all the jobs entail, because that's what they're going to have to judge. They're going to have to judge sound design. They're going to have to judge lighting design, and they're going to have to determine what separates good from bad. They're going to have to determine what constitutes the best. And I think that's one of the reasons that they put me on the committee, because I was one of the rare few people out there who actually knew what all the different jobs, what was entailed with all those jobs. So I think that's what happened, and it was an honor. I served on the nominating committee for 2012, 2013, and 2014.
Wow.
So if you remember those were wonderful years. But every time the nominations come out, people say, who are the idiots who made these nominations? And I just wanted to proudly say that for those 3 years, I was one of those idiots.
You're like the executive chef who tastes something and he knows exactly what spices are in it. You apparently now can look at a project and say, okay, that's excellent lighting, but watch that set. You just seem to know what's going on there because of all this. Right. That's wonderful.
Well, also, I mean, if you mentioned lighting design, you have to be able to tell the difference between the lighting design and the actual execution by the lighting staff, because you can have wonderful design, but if the staff doesn't do a good job with it, then it makes the lighting design look lousy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the lighting design was bad. So that's the kind of hair splitting that you need to do if you're really going to do a good job on that committee.
That's quite the hair splitting, because that could govern a career. Wow.
Right. And a lot of these things, like we're going to use lighting design once again, they're designed so that you don't notice them, so that you don't. I mean, every once in a while there'll be an amazing lighting effect, but that's not necessarily what determines a good lighting design. Sometimes the best lighting design is something that you don't really notice. And a long day's journey into night, the lighting has to gradually turn from daylight to night, and you just kind of barely realize it until suddenly the lights gradually come on in the house, in the Tyrone house, and suddenly you realize night fell somewhere in there. And, it has to be done in such a way that it's not like, hey, I'm the lighting designer. Look at my cool lighting design. Lighting designers, part of their skill is to not be noticed. So you're trying to notice something that's designed not to be noticed.
What's the big joke that people always say? They left the theater humming the costumes. So I guess it's that subtlety, that the tiniest of detail that really ushers your audience in.
Right, that's right. Well, and also I mentioned you have to do the work in collaboration. I spoke to one of the costume designers, and he was saying that the leader of the stage design team is the set designer. The set designer determines the level of reality in the scene. So he said, if people like walk from one room to another and there's no door, he said that he knows that he can just do the outer costumes. But he said if there's doorknobs on the doors, that means that the purses that the women are carrying have to have handkerchiefs inside of them, because that's the level of reality that you have to, following the lead of the set designer, you have to match that level of reality. I just love that detail. That was William Ivy Long, by the way, who said that. Okay. The wonderful, multiple Tony-winning William Ivy Long. And so that's the kind of discernment that I tried to bring to when I was making those nominations. And I know that my fellow nominators were also, they worked very hard to do an honest job and nominate things that they really thought were the best, not necessarily the things that were the most popular or, shows that were still running. People say, oh, they're not going to nominate any shows that aren't still running. When I was on that committee, it was like we really wanted to nominate the show that was best. And I saw sometimes the league wasn't always happy with our nominations. Well, because they were like, is this going to help the business? And it's like our job was not to help the business necessarily. Our job was to help the business by picking out what was the best.
I'm so glad you said that. So many people think what made the most money, so that's the best. No, it's not. The finest art doesn't necessarily have to be the one that makes the $1 million.
That's right.
Though how nice it would be, but nonetheless, how has you've been immersed in this your whole life? How has the theater changed as an art form, or even specifically in terms of Broadway or whatever? How has it changed over the decades?
Well, it has become much more seamless. There was a time when when a scene would end and like the curtains would close or the stage would go dark for a moment, so that the stagehands could bring in the next set. Mm-hmm. Nobody would stand for that anymore.
No, not everything wheels through. Yeah,
it's shocking when you see it like in a high school production. It's kind of shocking. But there was a time when that was the way it was done. And sometimes if it was a really long set change, they would close the curtain and they would actually write another little scene to be done in front of the curtain while the set was changing. And that's how we got No Business Like Show Business and a couple of other famous songs. They were just designed to cover an extra long set design.
What do they call those? Those are the in-one numbers.
The in-one numbers, exactly right. But I would say that, things have become Broadway shows have become much more like movies. There was a time when actors were taught to project. That means that they were able to, their voices, don't forget the theaters, think of the theaters not as buildings, think of them as giant musical instruments, like a giant horn. Mm-hmm. The stage is like the mouthpiece, and the auditorium is like the bell on the horn. And so it was designed so that people, don't forget when Broadway, all these things, sound amplification, it didn't exist. Sound amplification didn't even exist 50 years ago.
Right.
That was something relatively new. And so actors had to project their voices so that they could be heard in the back of the balcony. And, people were used to that. People were quiet, and the actors learned the technique of projecting their voices into the back of the auditorium because that was the only way they could be heard. People listen to opera singers and they're like, why are they yelling? Why are they yelling so loud? Well, it's so that you could be heard in in the 18th century in a 4,000 seat theater.
That's
it
right.
Made perfect sense. But things have become much more movie and television-ified. People were used to looking at the whole stage. Now, they're so used to seeing the actors' faces from close-ups that it's very hard. If you think about it, in the old days, you think about the old vaudevillian comedians. Jimmy Durante had what? What was his defining thing?
Good night, Mrs. Calabash, or
his big nose.
His big nose. Oh, of course.
And Eddie Cantor, he had the big eyes. He was
right.
Banjo eyes.
Right.
And Mae West, she had her big talent.
She had other eyes to look at. Yes,
that's
indeed.
right. Well, why did these stars have these things? It's because they could be seen in the back of the balcony.
Oh, that's so funny. Of course.
And now the actors all have these tiny little features on their faces. You look at when Mermans tried to do movies, people were like, look at that face. It's so big. It was hard for her to make that transition over to movies because she was so used to being seen at a distance. She'd come on movies with way too much makeup. And, people were used to seeing her from a distance. So, as I say, I think the stage that now you have to have this fluid transition from one seed to the other, and the action can't stop. You have actors who are used to, now they'll have the actors stand on stage and they'll put a pin spot on their face so that the audience can see their faces.
Right.
And of course they all have those little microphones now because people are used to hearing. They're not used to. I did the book on the Alchemy of Theater, and I interviewed Tony Miola, was the sound designer, and his name of his essay is called "Searching for Pianissimo." He feels that pianissimo, meaning very quiet, has been lost in the theater. People want to hear things. People are so used to hearing things really well, even when they're talking, that we've lost pianissimo. We've lost the quiet moments.
It's so funny you say that. Jerry Orbach in a documentary at one point, he was complaining. He said in his day he had to scream. He had to make sure he was heard. When he did Promises, even the Fantasticks, he had to be seen. Nowadays, you can whisper on stage. You don't have to be trained to have that kind of voice.
That's right. And of course, now in those days, the actors acted mainly on the stage, and the movies were silent in the old days.
Yep.
Now actors they play the movies, then they go to do a TV show, then they do a Broadway show. They may take a couple months to do a Broadway show, then they're back to a movie.
Yep.
So they to a certain degree they have to adapt their technique, but also the theater has learned that it has to adapt to the people who may not have had this training.
Yeah.
And so I would say, out of all those things, my first Broadway show I saw in 1971, it was the original production of Man of La Mancha at the very end of its run, and I was taken there on a school trip.
Oh, wow.
And I would have to say that from those days to this, that's the thing that has changed the most. The fluidity of the staging, the movification of the shows.
Yep.
Broadway's had to become a lot more like broadcast media. But, we still have that one advantage over them. We still have the actual live actors. They're right there in front of you. Their voices may be amplified artificially. They may, all these other things may affect what's happening, but they're still live.
It's funny you say that also because with her passing very recently, everyone's talking about Carol Channing being the definitive Dolly Levi and all of that. And then people are talking the role was written for Merman. And these are amazing actors and actresses, but they did not do the film versions. Merman did not do Gypsy. Right. Carol Channing, for all her identification, did not do the movie because maybe they were just too big. Maybe the audience, the camera couldn't hold this kind of performer anymore.
I think that's very true. I think what you're saying is exactly right. There were very few of those people who were able to make that transition from stage to movies. One of the few people who was able to do it was Robert Preston. He got to do The Music Man, although, quite honestly, they tried to replace him. But he had done movies before.
I was going to say that,
Angela Lansbury, similarly, she did movies before she had a Broadway career.
Right.
She had Oscar nominations. Angela is still with us. She's still singing. She had Oscar nominations before World War II. Think about that.
That's right, National Velvet or something like that. She's been omnipresent. She's
Oscar nominations before World War II, and she's still with us performing. So, I'm glad they used her in Mary Poppins Returns because, she's somebody who should really be treasured.
Yeah.
She should be treasured. Let's not wait until we write an obituary for her. Let's treasure her now.
Good point. Very good point.
We lost Channing, unfortunately. So that is something that I wrote a book called I'm the Greatest Star, which was the 40 greatest stars of Broadway from 1900 to the present. And several of these people that we've mentioned are on that list. Just to think about the amazing contributions that these people have made and are still making.
It's so ironic, but audience members don't know them from Broadway, but they'll know them from the movies. You mentioned Angela Lansbury. Right. Everyone probably remembers Murder, She Wrote. But they're not remembering the original Mame. They're not remembering so many other pieces. You look at whenever I talk about Jerry Orbach, and I think he was brilliant, so I always talk about him. Everyone remembers him as Lenny Briscoe in Law and Order, but no one's remembering Promises, Promises necessarily. And
well, it was interesting when I did my book on the Fantasticks. I interviewed him, and it was very difficult to get him to talk. I had a lot of questions about what it was like working on that show. We met at a restaurant near his house in the West 50s, and he agreed to the interview, but when he got there, I was just getting monosyllables out of him.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very frustrating because, he was a big name from the Fantasticks, and I really wanted to have a lot of material from him. And at one point, I was pulling every trick out of the hat that I could think of to get him comfortable and get him talking. And I happened to mention along the way that when I was in high school, I played Chuck Baxter in Promises, Promises. And as soon as I said that, his eyes lit up. Now, this was in the mid to late 1980s. So he hadn't really done Briscoe yet. He was working, he'd been in Chicago, and he never was out of work.
Right.
He was in 42nd Street. He was in 42nd Street. And the original Chicago. So he had plenty of other credits.
Oh, sure.
But his eyes lit up when I said Chuck Baxter. And he started saying, why isn't Promises, Promises an annuity for me the way King and I is for Yul Brynner and Dolly is for Carol Channing? They put out a tour every year, and they're always in there, and they're always working and in front of the public. Why is Promises not an annuity for me like that? And I was laughing because, he was much older, and Chuck Baxter is, he's not a kid, but he is a junior exec, or aspires to be a junior executive in this company.
In essence, he's the juvenile role. So there's just so many years to play that. Yeah.
Right. Dolly is she's a middle-aged woman.
Yeah.
The King, he says he's got, dozens of children already, so he's not a kid either.
Right.
But Chuck Baxter has to be played by a young actor.
Sure.
But Jerry did fine.
Yeah, I don't think he should complain. He was, to the end of his life, he was always a luminary on stage or in television.
He got his annuity.
So we met when you entered the world of Off Broadway, and now you're aside from reviewing the Toast of Broadway, you are in the audiences for a lot of these independent theaters. What's that like?
Wonderful. It's so exciting.
Good? Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
It's so exciting, and it's such a variety of things, and it's young actors who are really hungry, and it's new playwrights who are at the dawn of their careers, and it's very, very exciting. I mentioned that I saw my first Broadway show in 1971, and throughout those years I used to go down to Greenwich Village, and even then there was a sense that the exciting years had passed, the years of Cafe Chino, and when Circle in the Square was
Mm-hmm.
still in Sheridan Square, and things like that. And even then, there was a sense that it had passed. But I feel like now, when I'm seeing these off Broadway shows, I feel like I'm getting a little bit of that back. I feel like I'm seeing these wonderful things at the beginning, and they're not all fantastic. They're not all.
Yeah.
They don't always get raves from me. But I'm excited to see them. The only thing is, I'm at the point in my life where it's hard for me to walk up 4 flights of stairs to see a show, because some of those theaters they're up a couple of flights.
Yeah.
Not all.
Yeah.
Not all. But
and then some of them don't have the most comfortable of chairs, but that's another story.
I'm lucky that American Theater of Actors, I see so many things that they have an elevator, so God bless them for that. Oh yeah. I have so many clients there, and I'm so thrilled for that elevator. So yeah, I completely agree. So those are kind of, I would have to say, that's the range of pros and cons at doing the off Broadway. The excitement of seeing young talent, and even older talent that maybe doesn't work on Broadway anymore, but they're still working, and a lot of them are incredible. A lot of them are very exciting to see. So I love seeing the off Broadway shows. What advice would you give them? A 3,000-year-old sage such as yourself, what advice would you give them if any one of these, if a show from off Broadway saw you in the theater, ran over to you and said, "What did you think? What should we do? What's next?" What would someone like you tell them? Oh, I don't want them to come over. I don't even want them to notice that I'm there. I want them just to give the same performance that they give every night. That's what I really want to see. But as far as advice is concerned, people who are doing new plays, exciting new plays with young talent, and even older talent that still has the juice, I wouldn't give them any advice. I would say you're doing exactly what you should be doing. That's cool. That's what they should be doing. And one of the things I love about living in New York is you can walk down almost any street and somebody has tucked a little theater into one of the buildings. It's in the basement or it's up on the 4th floor. I talk about the talents that perform at these theaters, but you know what? That's not really what theater is. Theater, and I've said this before, theater does not happen on the stage. What happens on the stage is designed to evoke theater. Theater happens in the audience. So the real stars in New York, Jay, are the people who go to see the shows. Oh, the people who feel that theater is important to their lives. And they will walk up those flights of stairs, and they'll go down into those basements. And there's a million theaters in New York, and New Yorkers love to go to the theater. And I think that's something that you can't replicate in Pittsburgh, although Pittsburgh has some nice theaters too. You can't replicate in these other cities. Not that there aren't audiences there who are passionate about theater. It's the size of the audience that's passionate about theater, that feels it's part of their lives, that it's not just something that you give somebody for a holiday gift. It's something that they feel they incorporate into their lives. And those are the stars in New York. Those are the real stars in New York. It's the people who go to the theater all the time and support it and feel that it supports them. That's great. That is great. What's next for you? What's in the future for you? Well, I'm trying to, I would love to, although I'm retired from Playbill, I would love to teach. I would love to teach theater. As a matter of fact, I do have some things that I'm doing where I'm guest teaching, like I'm guest teaching at CCNY on February 21st. I'm going to be doing a class on 2 parts of theater that I don't think get noticed enough, and that is lyricists and orchestrators. Lyricists, people always talk, it's an Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. Yes, it is. And Andrew Lloyd Webber wrote the music, and the music's incredible. But who wrote the lyrics to that show? There is a lot of wonderful lyricists out there, and there's a lot of wonderful orchestrators. A lot of the things that you think of as the music for a show is actually created by the orchestra. The orchestrator chooses the instruments, and they use the instruments to help tell a story in a show. They illustrate the music. They help define the characters by the choice of instruments. So I'm going to be doing a whole class on that. I would love to, if there's somebody out there who's looking for a guest teacher, somebody out there who is looking for a lecturer, or somebody who wants a full-time professor. I would love to go back into the industry and share all this knowledge that I've gathered, because, when I'm gone, all these things that I've been talking to you about, they're all in my little head, and they'll all disappear.
Oh.
The only way for these things to live on is for me to convey them to young people, which I would love to do.
What an honor it would be to sit in your classroom. Please
thank
send
you.
me all information on your current lectures. Oh my gosh. The people that will sit and listen, they will come out of it. But, well, of course, they're the audience, they're the theater. They're going to come out of it so much better for hearing you. Wow.
I also have lectures that I do at libraries, I have 3 of them. I have one that's called the 10 Secrets of Broadway, which is it's a mixture of things like where the best seats are in different theaters, and how to get if you want to see Hamilton this Saturday night and you want to sit in a good seat, you can. There's a way to do it. It's going to cost you, but you can do it. That people say, why are tickets so expensive? Because people are willing to pay it. It's what the traffic will bear. But Broadway tickets are now more like airplane tickets. No two people pay the same price. You
Right.
can get the printed price, the price you see over the box office, is very few people actually pay that price. Most people either pay a big discount or a big premium,
Right.
depending on what they want. But I also talk about the backstage rituals and the traditions of the theater and the superstitions of the theater. And then my other talk that I do is called The Ghosts of Broadway, because, Jay, I collect ghost stories. And I've collected ghost stories from my entire career on things that are happening in the theaters that are in existence now. People who think that they actually have ghostly experiences at the theaters. And I do Broadway, but I also have theater stories from all around the world, ghost stories. I've never personally seen a theater ghost, I have to tell you. I don't know if I even believe in ghosts, but I do believe in ghost stories. People love to hear ghost stories. So
I have to connect you with Mary McCarry, she worked on Wonderful Town. She was in the Al Hirschfeld Theater, and she swears that something walked past her that wasn't there. And so many people say, oh, there's something in the balcony. Oh, there's someone sitting there, and it's not there.
Yes.
Oh, that's amazing.
They believe that Martin Beck haunts that theater because that theater was once known as the Martin Beck Theater.
That's right.
By an entrepreneur, Martin Beck. He actually started the Palace, and then he got fired. And his attitude was, screw you, I'm going to start my own theater. And he went a couple blocks over and started his own theater. And he was not happy when they renamed that theater. And he caused all sorts of mischief at that theater. And if you notice, the Jew Jamson, who owns that theater, they wound up putting up a big plaque in the lobby of the Al Hirschfeld Theater telling the story of Martin Beck.
That's the one way to keep them quiet, I guess.
Yes. I have as Jimmy Durante used to say, I got a million of them. I got a million ghost stories, and I do my lecture, The Ghosts of Broadway, and I tell the ghost stories. I get a lot of bookings around Halloween for that, but I can do it anytime. Anybody who's interested in hearing my ghost stories, I'm ready to go. And then also, in the month between the Tony nominations and the Tony Awards, I also do a lecture where I take people through the high and low points of that year's Tony nominations, and I do have some authority on this, having been on the committee.
That is great. Oh my God. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Please send me all information on every lecture, on everything. The world needs to hear you speak. There are very few sages. You make fun of your age and whatever, but there are very few sages left, and we need to hear what you have to say. Oh, that's wonderful.
But Mel Brooks did the 2,000-year-old man. I'm the 3,000-year-old theater critic.
Don't say it to Mel Brooks. He's still alive. So is Carl Reiner.
That's
They're
right.
both going to grab it.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. Robert, thank you so much. This has been enlightening. This has been entertaining. This has been wonderful.
My pleasure. And it's a pleasure to work with you and for you on your wonderful website.
Oh, my pleasure to have you.
Which treats Off Broadway just as importantly as Broadway. And you know something? It deserves that.
Thank you for saying that. That's something I've always said, and I thought I was the only one who does. It's a pleasure to hear someone of great intellect saying the very same thing. Thank you so much.
Very welcome.
Send me everything I want to tell the world about you. And I look forward so much to collaborating with you in the future.
Will do, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Ciao.
Bye.
That's terrific. That's really terrific. And now, are you ready for this? A word from our sponsors.
Do you like video games? Do you like to read? Alright, guys, I know that those two things usually don't go so well together, but my new book, The Minds Behind the Games, Interviews with Cult and Classic Video Game Developers, is kind of like an ESPN 30 for 30 collection of interviews with some of the coolest creators in video game history. We're talking iconic games, Deus Ex, Mortal Kombat, Wasteland, NBA Jam, not so iconic, E.T., Night Trap, indie games, Pro Wrestling X, Towerfall. If you love video games, you will love my book. If you know nothing about video games and want to get in the know, read my book. It's available wherever fine books are sold: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, and of course my site, patrickhickeyjr.com. It's an awesome book. I had a ton of fun writing it, and simply put, if you want to get in the know and you want to find out stuff that's not even on Wikipedia, check it out. You won't regret it.
Ladies and gents, that was Patrick Hickey telling us about his exciting book about the genesis, pardon the pun, of video games. His book is flying off the shelves and is #1 in so many markets. Hickey's book reaffirms the great power of video entertainment and the genius it took to create its many facets. All right, it has been an honor to call Robert Viagas friend and colleague, and it affirms my belief that the great ones are right there in front of us. On that topic, next podcast, we'll be chatting with Pat Addis and Jim Kierstead, two prominent Broadway producers who still walk the walk of the indie arts. See you then.